The afternoon of August 26, 1346, changed warfare forever. On a ridge near the village of Crécy in northern France, roughly 12,000 English soldiers stood waiting. They had ravaged the French countryside for weeks, burning towns and looting their way through Normandy. Now, exhausted and outnumbered, they faced the full might of France. Below them, across muddy fields still wet from a sudden rainstorm, an army of at least 30,000 French troops assembled. At the center of that glittering host rode the flower of French nobility, thousands of mounted knights encased in steel plate armor, their war horses draped in protective cloth. These were the elite warriors of medieval Europe, men who had trained since childhood for mounted combat, whose ancestors had dominated battlefields for centuries. They had never lost to common foot soldiers. They had never faced anything like what was about to happen. Among the English ranks stood approximately 7,000 longbowmen, most of them Welsh or English commoners. They carried 6-foot bows of yew wood, weapons that required a lifetime of training to master. Each man had roughly 70 arrows stuck into the ground at his feet. When the French knights charged that evening, these archers would unleash a storm of projectiles so devastating that chroniclers compared it to snow falling from the sky. By nightfall, thousands of French soldiers would lie dead or dying in the mud. Contemporary chroniclers reported staggering losses, with estimates ranging from 10,000 to as many as 30,000 French casualties, including 11 princes and over 1,200 knights. English casualties, by stark contrast, numbered perhaps 40 men, according to a roll call conducted after the battle, though some sources suggest slightly higher figures. The age of the knight as the supreme battlefield weapon had ended. The age of the longbow had begun. The English longbow was not simply a larger bow. It was a weapon system that required extraordinary strength and years of practice to use effectively. While no longbows survive from the Crécy period itself, we can understand their power through later examples. Recovered from the Tudor warship Mary Rose, which sank in 1545, these bows measured between 6 feet 2 inches and 6 feet 11 inches in length, with an average of 6 feet 6 inches. Tests on these preserved weapons revealed draw weights between 100 and 185 pounds, with most falling around 150 pounds. Given that the longbow was a mature technology by the Tudor period, and that medieval illustrations show similar designs, these specifications likely reflect the warbows used at Crécy 2 centuries earlier. To put that in perspective, a modern recreational bow might have a draw weight of 40 to 60 pounds. Drawing a 150-pound bow required the archer to pull with a force equivalent to lifting 150 pounds, using only the muscles of the back, shoulders, and arms. The physical demands were so extreme that archaeologists can identify longbowmen from their skeletons. Archers developed enlarged left arm bones to handle the compression force of holding the bow while drawing, and their right arms showed increased bone density from the pulling motion. Many showed signs of stress injuries and arthritis in their shoulders and fingers. Their left shoulders often sat visibly lower than their right from years of bearing that enormous load. This wasn't just practice, this was physiological transformation. Boys began training as young as 7 years old, and the English crown made archery practice mandatory. King Edward I banned all sports except archery on Sundays and holidays. Villages maintained practice grounds called butts, where men were required to shoot regularly. Henry VII's records show a detailed system for training boys with progressively heavier bows as they grew stronger. The arrows themselves were formidable projectiles. Called cloth-yard shafts, they measured roughly 27 inches long on average, based on arrows recovered from the Mary Rose, and were tipped with various head designs depending on the target. Bodkin points, narrow and armor-piercing, could punch through chainmail at close range and even penetrate some plate armor. Broadheads inflicted devastating wounds on unarmored men and horses. Fired from a 150-pound bow, these arrows could reach effective ranges of 250 to 300 yards. More importantly, a skilled archer could potentially maintain a rate of fire of 6 to 10 arrows per minute under ideal conditions, though the actual rate in sustained combat remains debated among historians. Some contemporary accounts from Crécy claim English archers were firing at remarkable speeds in the initial volleys. With 7,000 archers shooting even at a conservative rate, the English could launch tens of thousands of arrows per minute into the French ranks. To understand why this was revolutionary, we need to understand what longbowmen were fighting against. The mounted knight represented the pinnacle of medieval military technology and social organization. A knight wasn't simply a soldier. He was the product of a system that had dominated European warfare for centuries. Under the feudal hierarchy, knights served as heavily armed vassals who pledged loyalty to lords in exchange for land grants. In return, knights owed their lords military service, typically around 40 days per year, though extended campaigns often lasted much longer. This system created a class of professional warriors who could afford the staggering costs of their profession. The expense was astronomical. A complete set of quality plate armor could cost a substantial portion of a knight's annual income, while a proper war horse represented a massive investment. By the 15th century, custom-made plate armor from renowned Italian armorers could cost several months of income for even wealthy knights. These suits weren't just protective shells. They were precisely engineered systems of articulated steel plates that allowed surprising mobility while offering protection against swords, lances, maces, and arrows. A knight in full harness was effectively a human tank, nearly invulnerable to most weapons of the period. The training was equally intensive. Boys from noble families began as pages around age 7, learning horsemanship, courtly manners, and basic weapon skills. At 14 or 15, they became squires, serving established knights while mastering mounted combat with lance, sword, and mace. They practiced charging wooden targets called quintaines, which would spin and strike them if they hit incorrectly, teaching precise lance control at full gallop. They wrestled, climbed, and ran in full armor to build the strength needed to fight, while encumbered with 50 to 60 pounds of steel. By age 21, those who survived this brutal apprenticeship were dubbed knights in formal ceremonies, taking oaths of chivalry and loyalty. When these armored warriors charged in formation, they were virtually unstoppable. Horses added speed and mass to the impact. A knight and his war horse together might weigh 1,500 pounds, all focused into a lance point traveling at 30 miles per hour. Infantry formations that stood their ground were simply trampled or scattered. For centuries, only other knights could reliably fight knights. Peasant levies with spears and pitchforks stood no chance. This was the military reality that dominated European battlefields from the 9th century through the early 14th century. The road to Crécy began with dynastic ambition. When French King Charles IV died in 1328 without male heirs, Edward III of England claimed the French throne through his mother, Isabella of France. The French nobility rejected this claim under Salic law, which barred inheritance through the female line, and crowned Philip VI instead. This dispute ignited the Hundred Years' War, a conflict that would consume both nations for over a century. By 1346, Edward had assembled a substantial invasion force, with chroniclers reporting hundreds of ships carrying around 14,000 to 16,000 men, including his 16-year-old son, Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince. Landing near Cherbourg on July 12th, Edward's army began a chevauchée, a devastating raid through Normandy designed to terrorize the population, gather supplies, and provoke Philip into battle. They burned Caen after a brutal assault that reportedly killed over 5,000 French soldiers and civilians. They advanced to within 2 miles of Paris before turning north, trying to link up with Flemish allies. Philip pursued with what sources describe as an enormous army. The English had to cross the Somme River to escape, finally forcing a ford at Blanchetaque on August 24th after their longbowmen drove off French defenders. Exhausted from weeks of marching and fighting, Edward needed to make a stand. He chose his ground carefully. The ridge between Crécy and Waudecourt offered ideal defensive terrain. It sloped gently upward from the valley below, forcing attackers to charge uphill through muddy fields. Woods protected both flanks, preventing the French from outflanking the English position. Edward deployed his army in 3 divisions. His son commanded the right wing, the Earls of Arundel and Northampton the left, while Edward himself held the reserve. Each division consisted of dismounted men-at-arms in the center, flanked by forward-curving wedges of longbowmen. This formation, with archers positioned on both flanks, allowed maximum fields of fire. The archers could shoot into the flanks of any force attacking the center, creating a killing zone. Contemporary accounts mention that the English also dug small pits in front of their position to disrupt cavalry charges, and some sources claim they deployed a handful of primitive cannons, though these early firearms would have had minimal impact. The English had one more crucial advantage. They were well rested and well fed, having used their day to prepare the position. The French, after marching all day, arrived in the late afternoon already exhausted. Philip's vanguard included roughly 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries renowned as some of the finest in Europe. These professionals often fought in teams, one crossbowman and assistants, with one carrying a pavis, a large shield to protect the shooter while reloading. The Genoese had earned their reputation in countless battles across the Mediterranean world. They were expensive, elite troops, and Philip counted on them to weaken the English position before his knights charged. But the Genoese had left their pavises with the baggage train in the rushed advance. Without these shields, they would be exposed while reloading. Crossbows were powerful weapons, but they fired slowly. Even with mechanical spanning devices, a crossbowman could manage perhaps 2 to 3 shots per minute at best. Worse, around 4 p.m., just as the French prepared to attack, a sudden rainstorm swept across the battlefield. The English archers simply unstrung their bows and tucked the strings under their leather caps to keep them dry. Crossbows couldn't be unstrung as easily. The rain soaked and stretched their strings, reducing both power and range. When the storm passed and the attack began, the Genoese advanced uphill, shouting and beating their drums as was their custom. They loosed their bolts at the English line. The shots fell short. Then the English archers stepped forward 1 pace, drew their great bows to full draw, and released. Contemporary chronicler Jean Froissart described what happened next in words that have echoed through centuries. The English archers each stepped forth 1 pace, drew the bowstring to his ear, and let their arrows fly, so wholly and so thick that it seemed as snow. The Genoese, already exhausted and without their protective pavises, broke almost immediately under this devastating fire. Some accounts suggest they managed only 1 or 2 volleys before retreating. Others claim they never got off a single effective shot. Either way, they fled back down the hill in disorder. What happened next sealed their fate and doomed the French army. The mounted knights behind them, seeing their hired crossbowmen retreat, believed them to be cowards or traitors. King Philip allegedly shouted, "Kill me those scoundrels, for they stop up our road without any reason." The French cavalry rode forward, trampling their own fleeing crossbowmen while trying to reach the English. This was exactly the chaos Edward had hoped for. The cavalry charges that followed were heroic and suicidal. French knights, among the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, charged uphill through mud, past fleeing crossbowmen, into a storm of arrows fired from both flanks. The English longbowmen maintained a sustained barrage that contemporary sources universally describe as overwhelming. Horses, unarmored or lightly armored, fell by the hundreds. Knights tumbled into the mud, weighed down by their armor. Those who reached the English lines on foot faced dismounted men-at-arms and infantry wielding polearms designed specifically to drag knights from horses or batter them to the ground. The French made 15 to 16 separate charges that evening, each with the same result. Fresh contingents of knights would form up, charge uphill, and dissolve under the arrow storm before reaching the English line. Those few who made it through found themselves isolated, surrounded, and pulled down by English infantry. King John of Bohemia, who had been blind for a decade after losing his sight from ophthalmia during a crusade in Lithuania, provides one of the battle's most haunting stories. Though he was 50 years old and unable to see the slaughter, he asked his knights to lead him into battle so he could strike at least one blow. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, they tied the reins of their horses together and charged. All were killed, and the next day they were found lying around their king, still bound together. The Black Prince's division, bearing the brunt of the attacks, came under such pressure that a knight rode to Edward III begging for reinforcements. The king asked if his son was dead or wounded. Told he was not, Edward replied words that would become legend. "Then let the boy win his spurs." The prince held. The battle continued until near midnight. When dawn broke on August 27th, the English discovered the full extent of their victory. Contemporary chroniclers reported staggering French losses. Medieval sources often exaggerated numbers, but even conservative modern estimates suggest thousands of French dead lay scattered across the muddy fields. Among them were some of the most prominent nobles in Europe, including King John of Bohemia, King James of Majorca, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Flanders, the Count of Blois, and Philip's own brother, Charles of Alençon. Over 1,200 knights and men-at-arms of noble birth perished. English casualties, by comparison, were remarkably light. The most reliable account, based on a roll call conducted after the battle, reported approximately 40 English deaths. The disparity was so stark that many chroniclers struggled to believe the accounts. How could common archers armed with wooden bows slaughter armored knights in such numbers? The answer lay in the brutal mathematics of the longbow. A skilled archer shooting at a sustained rate could potentially loose several arrows per minute, meaning 7,000 archers could launch tens of thousands of arrows every minute. The French were charging uphill through mud into what was effectively a continuous barrage. Each arrow carried enough kinetic energy to penetrate mail armor at close range. Bodkin points could punch through some plate armor or find gaps at joints, visors, and underarms. Even if an arrow didn't penetrate, the impact could knock a man off his horse or stagger him enough to make him vulnerable. Horses, with minimal armor, fell immediately when struck. A dismounted knight in heavy steel plate, struggling through mud, became nearly helpless. The crossbow, for all its power, simply couldn't compete. Firing 2 to 3 shots per minute versus 6 to 10 meant the English maintained 3 to 4 times the rate of fire. One Italian merchant who recorded information from participants claimed English archers fired 3 arrows for every crossbow bolt. This volume of fire, combined with the tactical advantage of high ground and a defensive position, proved overwhelming. The French cavalry, fighting piecemeal in uncoordinated charges, never had a chance to bring their superior numbers to bear effectively. Crécy's impact rippled far beyond that single battlefield. Edward marched to Calais and besieged it, knowing Philip couldn't risk another field battle. The siege lasted nearly a year, ending with the city's surrender in August 1347. Calais remained English territory for over 200 years, a permanent foothold on the continent. More importantly, Crécy shattered the psychological dominance of the mounted knight. For centuries, heavily armored cavalry had been virtually invincible. Now, common archers had proven they could not only defeat knights, but massacre them wholesale. The military implications were revolutionary. Within a decade, another English victory at Poitiers in 1356 reinforced the lesson. The French king himself was captured. At Agincourt in 1415, Henry V's outnumbered English army, perhaps 6,000 men facing 20,000 to 30,000 French, repeated the pattern. Once again, longbowmen in defensive positions slaughtered charging French cavalry. Once again, French casualties numbered in the thousands, while English losses remained minimal. The pattern was undeniable. Infantry armed with longbows, properly positioned and disciplined, could defeat any cavalry force. The social and military transformation that followed took decades, but proved irreversible. English kings, recognizing the longbow's value, mandated its practice throughout the realm. Archery became a national obsession. Villages competed in tournaments. Merchants imported so much yew wood from continental Europe that Poland had to protect its forests from deforestation. The longbow created a military system where England's relatively small population could field armies capable of defeating much larger French forces. It was England's secret weapon, maintained through legal requirement and cultural commitment for nearly 3 centuries. For knights, Crécy marked the beginning of the end. Armor continued to evolve, becoming thicker and more sophisticated, but this only made knights slower and more expensive. By the late 15th century, gunpowder weapons were emerging, and these would finish what the longbow began. The last major English battle where longbows played a significant role was Flodden in 1513. After that, they remained in use for hunting and sport but disappeared from serious military service. The era of heavy cavalry dominance, which had lasted nearly 600 years, was over. The lessons of Crécy echo through military history. Combined arms tactics, where different troop types support each other, proved superior to relying on a single elite force. Defensive positions with ranged weapons could defeat offensive charges. Technology and training mattered more than individual courage or noble birth. These principles, first demonstrated on that muddy field in northern France, remain fundamental to warfare today. The longbow itself may be obsolete, but the revolution it sparked at Crécy changed how wars were fought forever. When those English archers stepped forward on August 26, 1346, they did more than win a battle. They ended an age. The age of the knight as the supreme weapon had lasted for centuries, but it died in the mud of Crécy, buried under thousands of arrows fired by common men who had spent their lives mastering a weapon that demanded nothing but time, discipline, and extraordinary strength. The flower of French nobility, the finest warriors Europe could produce, learned that courage and training meant nothing against the brutal mathematics of sustained arrow fire. It was not the end of knighthood as a social class, but it was the end of the knight's invincibility on the battlefield. If you found this story fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe to the Codex of History for more untold stories from the medieval world. We dive deep into the battles, weapons, and warriors that changed history, bringing you the facts behind the legends. Don't miss our next video.